Okay, so this will be part 2 of the introductory lecture to the mythology of King Lear. And I'm going to summarize a little bit what I said in the previous lecture, and hopefully this will clarify some of the pieces. Basically, what I was saying in the previous lecture is that the key symbols in King Lear in terms of how to interpret the myth and moral structure of the play are related to a much older mythological structure that are present in many narratives throughout the world. If you look at a lot of old mythologies, you'll see a very similar structure that Shakespeare is using in the play. And we want to remember that this is a play that takes place in a pre-Christian era, but is shown to an audience that is post-Christian. So a lot of what Shakespeare is trying to do is marry the pre-Christian mythological symbols and pre-Christian morality with a post-Christian mythological symbol and post-Christian morality. So what I'm trying to do for these introductory lectures is basically set the stage of a set of symbols that we will see interacting with each other. So in the previous lecture, I focused on the feminine element. And the major structure that you can kind of think about, you have a female or feminine principle, and you have a male principle, and then you have the principle that is generated by the joining of the two. And we can see how this is a very Christianized mythology. But there are elements that are pre-Christian to it as well. We also want to remember that the cosmological view of the people in this time period and the people who, in the time period in which the play is said to take place, did not have the modern understanding of the solar system. They looked at the world where human beings were essentially the most important organism, that the Earth was at the very center of the entire universe, and everything was sort of oriented around the Earth and around the human being itself. So this is the structure that we are dealing with, and it's cosmological, but it's also moral. How one should act and how one should behave is based upon that structure. And so you can't really understand the morality without understanding the cosmological structure and the mythological structure. So we talked previously about the feminine principle and how a lot of that represents the sort of chaotic environment on the outside that in many ways can pose a threat to human society. And so if you imagine a circle, okay, and on the very outside of the circle is total chaos, and as you move inwards towards the middle of the circle, you get more and more orderly. So as you move in, you sort of, the middle area is this kind of half civilized, half chaotic natural world. And you can think of this as agriculture, and you can think of this as the hunting realm. And so this is, in Greek mythology or Roman mythology, would have been ruled by the goddess of agriculture and the goddess of hunting. You think of, say, like Artemis, okay, who represents the joining of culture, civilized culture, and the natural world, right? Agriculture. It's the kind of raw nature that has been culturized for the use of the human being. And the mythological structure of how this is done relates male and female principles together. The female principle is at its root chaotic, but also life-giving. And the male principle is the one that is orderly, that provides order to the chaotic structure. And in this order, you have the heavenly realm with the Father God in heaven who represents ultimate order. And then the human king on earth is the earthly representative of that same order. And so it's the king's task to maintain the proper order in society and on the earth. Because when things get out of order, then too much chaos erupts into society. So the basic concept is that the hero subdues the dragon, which represents chaos, in order to become the king for the sake of the greater society. It's necessary for the hero to subdue the chaos first, and because they are able to do so, they are the one worthy to become king. Now, the new king has very particular attributes. They have to rule with vision. They have to be able to perceive the situation correctly. First, they have to be able to identify chaos when it shows itself, and they have to be able to envision the correct future for society. And they also have to rule with truthfulness. Truthfulness is very important in the sense that it's the opposite of deception. Anything that is covered up and unknown can, in a sense, deceive you. So truthfulness is a way of revealing things to the present. The king's job is to protect against the future threat of chaos with his vision and his ability to be deeply truthful. Therefore, the order and stability of society is dependent upon the moral quality of the king. And these are the moral qualities of vision and truthfulness. The less vision a king has, and the more deceitful a king is, then the greater risk for the crumbling of society. And this is a huge theme in King Lear. We see blindness occur all over the place in many of the immoral characters, beginning with the king himself. The king is blind to the initial situation at hand, can't perceive correctly, and so as a result makes catastrophic choices in terms of the society that he lives in. And so Shakespeare is making a point about if you can't act truthfully, if you can't see the truth, and you can't act the truth, then what you're actually going to do, especially if you're the king, is destroy the society that you live in. So, here's a picture of the storm god defeating the creature of chaos, the chimeric creature of chaos. So the storm god here represents the order of society, defeating the creature of chaos on the left. And this is the eternal battle, right? This is not one moment, okay? It's a picture, but it's constantly happening. And it's constantly happening all the way from the very inner psyche of the human being all the way out into society and the world at large. The same battle of order versus chaos. So what is it that makes King Lear a tragedy? Well, in some sense, tragedy can be defined as an inversion of how we think things should be. Take the idea of karma. We feel that it's somehow fair or just that people who do bad things get bad consequences for their action. And we can understand that very easily. But what we find very difficult to understand is when really horrible things happen to really good people. And so a lot of this happens in King Lear, and it's extremely tragic. And a lot of the reasoning, remember, it's a play, so we're watching the action happen. And what we see, and what this point that he's trying to make, is that even the actions of the immoral people wrap up the good people in this kind of whirlwind of negative action, of violent action and suffering, and drag along all of the moral people with them. So when you act in an immoral way, you're not just affecting yourself, you're affecting the entire structure of society and the other people that live in the society with you. And so when the good characters die or suffer as a result of what the bad characters are doing, then we see this as a tragedy. It's an inversion. The good people aren't supposed to suffer. It's the bad people that are supposed to suffer. And it can be compounded if the bad people get what they want. Then it becomes almost incomprehensible in terms of how did this happen. So tragedy can be seen as an inversion or a disruption of the archetypal characters in the drama. Lear was supposed to be this incredibly moral king. That was his job, to see the truth, to act the truth, to have this profound vision of society and represent the divine order. And he just blows the whole thing in the first scene because of his madness that is not even his own fault. One of the terribly tragic things about this play is a lot of the things that happen are not necessarily the fault of the characters themselves. You can really empathize with how they ended up in this situation, and yet at the same time, the consequences of their actions are utterly horrific. Tragedy is also the suffering of the human being at the hands of chaos. Lear's madness is an example of it. It's not his fault that he's gone crazy, but his actions still have terrible consequences in the play. And so the whole thing is hard to justify because it seems unfair that he's suffering the madness, and it seems unfair that others should suffer as a result of his terrible decisions, yet there's nobody really to blame for it. And also tragedy is the suffering of the human being at the hands of each other. We see some deeply sinister characters in the play who seem to take pleasure at the suffering of other people. And this is really an inversion of the moral quality of what we expect from other people. And so it's deeply tragic because they're causing suffering to the quote-unquote good or moral people of the play. So when Lear abdicates and breaks the natural order of society, right? It's his job to maintain the order. He plunges his whole world into chaos. There's a powerful drawing where Lear, in a graphic novel adaptation of the play, in the first scene, Lear grabs his crown, and as he's dividing the kingdom, he literally breaks the crown in two with his bare hands. And this is an incredible metaphor for what he's really doing. It's bad to take your sovereign kingdom and divide it amongst multiple heirs. All that's going to happen is chaos. So the protector king, who is supposed to represent order, has been inverted and now becomes the dragon of chaos. And there's actually a line where Lear tells Kent, "Don't get in the way of the dragon." It's a very strange line, and I really think that it matches or maps onto this idea of a chaos dragon. He's disordering the chain of being. He's not fulfilling his particular role that he's supposed to, and thus sends the whole thing spiraling into chaos. In a way, he infantilizes himself. He wants all of the power. The way that he gets rid of it, he basically says, well, I still have all the good parts of being king, I just don't want any of the decision-making responsibility. And this is like the opposite of what the hero is supposed to do. The hero is supposed to shoulder the burden of responsibility, regardless of their place within society in terms of social power, right? He wants the power that comes from being king, but he doesn't want to carry the responsibility. And this is the inversion. You're supposed to carry the responsibility without worrying about the power that you have based on your social position. So I've talked about this chain of being, and what it is a natural hierarchy by which all things are ordered and have their particular place. You can think of it somewhat as a two-tiered structure with the human being standing right in the middle. And the higher you go in the structure, the more good one becomes, or really it's the more complex one becomes. And as you go down, you become more simple, and sort of you're so simplified that you are rendered inexistent, right? The most simple thing is the number 0, essentially. Nothingness. And the human being has the capability to posture themselves towards the good, to go up on the chain of being, or to posture themselves downwards and be part of the things that are below them. And it's a participation. It's not that the human turns into an angel or something like that. It's just that, are they participating in the higher order, or are they participating in the lower order? And I'm going to dig more into detail with this when we look at the character of Edmund and and look at the story of Edmund versus Edgar and some of the issues that are arising there. So here's a very interesting picture that depicts this. So what we see here at the very bottom is sort of hell, right? And then at the very beginning of the chain of being, we have kind of just stuff, non-living things, and then the most simple living organisms are plants, and then we have the various kinds of animals. We have the human beings who exist essentially in the middle, in between the natural realm and then the heavenly realm up here, where we have the heavenly beings and the divine God, King God, essentially at the top. And you can see the chain of being going all the way down and all the way up. And it's we're going to come back to this interesting idea also. We have a feminine and a masculine element tied to or connected to the chain of beings. We want to remember that both elements are consistently present. Here's another comparative way of looking at it. And again, it's a very interesting picture. We see still the snake present in the lower realm, the dragon-type serpent here who's consuming the tree. Again, we have the vertical structure. The world in which the human beings live, again, represented by the serpent eating its tail. The area where the human beings live being directly in the middle, and then you have the heavenly realm above it. Here's another way of looking at it. And this also articulates the idea, which we'll approach later, that the people of this time period believed that the heavenly bodies dictated who human beings were and how they were act. So they dictated both traits and behavior. And you can think of them, as illustrated here, as these interlocking wheels. And the wheels are constantly turning and moving and shifting. And through that, it's changing the orientation of the thing in the middle. So as things shift around here, then the particular pattern that they're making changes, and so it changes the human being who's in the middle. Now, again, we see this really interesting structure where this almost ape-like creature is being connected by a chain to the divine woman, who also is being connected by a chain to the sort of disembodied God. And this is the entire structure of the natural world in a mythological sense. And we're going to return to this feminine figure when we look a little bit more deeply again at the Edmund and Edgar story. So, how do we know who is good and who is bad based on this mythological structure? Well, we can look at a set of elements, the positive elements and the negative elements. And when we associate particular characters, or when Shakespeare associates particular characters with these things, then we can know, okay, this is a good character, a moral character. And when we associate characters with the negative elements, then we know that they are the immoral characters. So the positive elements in this structure are light, sun, vision, knowledge, order, and the idea of heaven. And these are all kind of related, and they're really related around the idea of being able to see and perceive accurately. And then the negative elements are their opposites, basically. It's a kind of blindness, the inability to see. If you don't have light or knowledge, you have no vision of what's happening. It's also related to the idea of deception and being manipulative. Someone who's deceiving is relying on the blindness of others. Somebody who is manipulative is relying on the other person not perceiving what it is that they're doing. Whereas the moral person is constantly telling the truth and constantly saying, look, if you accurately perceive what I'm doing, that's fine, because I also am okay with that. I want you to see what I'm doing. So tragedy can also be seen as an inversion of the desired elements. We want people to have vision. We want there to be order, and we want there to be sanity. So which is a kind of intellectual order, if our mind is ordered, right, then we're a sane person. And so tragedy is when the other elements start to take over. We don't want them to win. We don't want blindness to be the main sort of motivating factor in people. We don't want chaos to be the thing that is in charge. We don't want people to descend into madness. So if there's a kind of victory of these negative elements, then we perceive this as tragic. Blindness will come up so much. Which characters can see or hear the truth? This is how we know who is moral and who isn't. Who has the vision to accurately see? And when we dive into the first scene, it will be very apparent that Kent is castigating Lear for being deeply blind to the situation. And when we dive into the Edmund's soliloquy and his plot against Edgar and his father Gloucester, we'll see that Gloucester suffers from a kind of blindness that Edmund takes advantage of. And Shakespeare lays a crushing judgment on Gloucester, even though Gloucester doesn't necessarily actively try to be a bad person. His willful blindness, his sort of self-absorbed blindness, gets him into trouble, which Shakespeare makes him pay a significant price for. This is not a new concept. The eye of Horus from Egyptian mythology is one of the most powerful concepts. And the idea is that Horus can see things as they really are. And the pharaoh, the great ruler of Egypt, has to have the eye of Horus in order to accurately and effectively rule his society. Here again we see the eyes associated with light and the sun as well. And what's interesting, we see a snake wrapped around the sun, perched on the falcon-headed. Right? What animal has some of the greatest vision? Birds of prey. So, I'm an ancient person. How do I want to represent the concept of see really well, better than everybody else? Well, I give it the head of the thing that sees the best, a bird of prey. Here's another picture. If we go a little bit further, remember we're talking about pre-Christian setting. Here we have the god Apollo, and Apollo represents all of those same qualities. We see the sun around the head of Apollo. It's a crown. Why does a king wear a golden crown? Because the king is supposed to represent the idea that sun and vision and knowledge are encapsulated and contained within that person. So the crown is literally a symbolic representation of the sun, which is then a symbolic representation of the divine vision and represents the idea that the king is the representative of divine order in earth. Some other examples. Cordelia, who we'll look at later, is very truthful, and she has vision to see rightly. She sees that her sisters are being flattery, and she refuses to succumb to it. So she, in a sense, is the true representative of order in this situation. And what is the very first thing Lear does? He banishes her from his kingdom. And so in a literal sense, or a symbolic sense, however you might want to think it, Lear banishes order from his kingdom. By banishing Cordelia, who represents truth, order, and vision, he banishes those qualities from his kingdom. And therefore, the whole thing descends into chaos. Lear is tyrannical. When order shifts away from the good and basically moves too far, it becomes authoritarian. And that's what tyranny is. It's order that has been put too far. Lear is also descending into mental chaos, and he's blind to the truth. Later we'll see another tragedy of the story is that Lear is somewhat aware that his madness is taking over, and there are times when he is confused about what happened and what he did and why he is where he is, and we see that the madness is its own thing. And so it's very tragic for Lear as a character, because we come to realize that he can't control much of what it is that he's doing. But Shakespeare still holds him accountable. So Cordelia and Lear are, in a sense, two sides of the dragon. In talking about that, the way that we might say they both represent the feminine elements. One represents the dangerous chaos, and one represents the positive elements of the feminine. So Cordelia can be compared to the concept of the Virgin Mary. So Cordelia represents the positive elements of the natural world, right? The Virgin Mary crushes the snake with her heel and gives birth to the hero. The nature and goddess has a kind of within without structure, that the within the individual contains the positive elements and the negative elements, but also society at large outside the individual contains those positive and negative elements as well. And more tragedy, there's an inversion of the victory of chaos over the order, and there's no birth to the hero. So instead of the positive feminine element crushing the snake of chaos and birthing the new hero who will bring the new order, victory is not had and no hero is born. This is an inversion of the archetypal story. So here's a pictorial representation of what I mean. And we see Mary the Virgin stepping on the snake and crushing it beneath her heel. This is the positive element of the feminine. Both elements are present here. And the idea is, do you want to accentuate the negative or do you want to accentuate the positive? And the teaching is, crush the negative, accentuate the positive. Another picture of essentially the same thing. We have the snake wrapped around the world being crushed by the heel of the Virgin Mary, who represents the divine feminine. Here's a similar picture as well. An icon which shows that within the divine feminine, the heroic figure is born who brings ultimate order to the world. This is obviously the Christian redemption story, that the Christ figure is the one who ultimately redeems the world and brings back the divine order. But the icon makes the point that it's the Christ figure is born within the body of the divine feminine. We'll talk later also about how the words must be enfleshed into the actions of the individuals. It's not enough for the characters to say, the characters must do. And this is a necessity. Some contemporary examples. We have the later Lady Liberty, the goddess of freedom, leading the oppressed French people to victory. This is essentially a religious picture. This is a divine figure in the middle of this picture. It's not really symbolic. Maybe it is, but it's also very literal. And we have our own divine figure standing outside the gates to our country, the Statue of Liberty. Notice how they're always holding in their hands particular instruments. If we were to go and look at several other Greek goddesses, you would see that the right hand holds some kind of staff of power, and the left hand contains within it essentially the instrument that represents who they are. And here we have the Statue of Liberty, which represents liberal democracies, freedom of the individual. We see the sun crown, the fire, and the book of knowledge. So all of these positive elements, these mythological symbols, are planted onto this figure. And this is a contemporary figure. So, what are the key takeaways from this introduction? Morality in the play is defined by mythological structure and drama. The good is that which creates and sustains this same structure, and the evil is that which threatens the stability of the structure. And so the battle of good versus evil is a drama that plays itself out over and over and over again. And it looks different, but it's the same story. And the characters in this particular drama will represent different aspects of the larger archetypal drama. And then tragedy is, in some sense, the inversion of the standard narrative. But it's also an inversion of what we expect to happen. It plays upon our sense of fairness and justice, where we think the bad people get bad consequences and the good people get good consequences. But that's not how life is. And we'll see in the later lectures that Shakespeare makes a point with his tragedy that life itself is deeply tragic, and bad people can have good outcomes and good people can have bad outcomes, and the whole thing gets really messy and tangled up within itself. So the upcoming lectures that we'll look at, we'll look at the first scene and see how these moral markers map onto the scene, and we'll pull out some lines for evidence. And then we'll look at the character of Edmund and Edgar, and we'll dive deeply into Edmund and see how he's the pinnacle of the evil character based on this mythological and moral structure. And we'll pull out a bunch of pieces to show how what we're saying supports that Edmund is an evil character. We'll also make some comparisons between Edgar and Edmund and some biblical stories. Remember, this is a Christian audience, but the play takes place in pre-Christian. So Shakespeare wants the audience to understand, have something to base the older stories upon. So he's going to draw from some old Christian narratives, specifically the book of Genesis. We're going to compare Edgar and Edmund to Cain and Abel, and to Jacob and Esau. And we're going to look how those stories inform what Shakespeare is doing with the Edgar-Edmund situation.